The boy was 3 when the wolves came for his father. Not beasts of fur and fang, but men in robes, smiling with their teeth. They took everything: the title, the land, the dignity, and finally, the man himself. Domitius Ahenobarbus died sick, hated, and alone, whispering curses to a ceiling that never listened. The Senate called it justice. The family called it survival. His son said nothing. He only stared at the red wax seal on the final edict, not yet old enough to read it, but old enough to know it meant something had ended. His name was Lucius. The blood in his veins came from Augustus, from the steel-spined Julii, from gods made flesh. But in Rome, blood was currency only if you knew how to spend it, and his mother had just gone bankrupt. Agrippina was banished days later, exiled by Caligula for sins no one dared define. One rumor said she tried to poison her way back into power. Another said she merely spoke too soon at the wrong banquet. In Rome, there was little difference. Exile required no reason, only fear, so the boy was left behind. He became a ghost in silk, visible, valuable, but never held too tightly, passed from house to house, raised by relatives who feared what he might become. He was taught to speak little, eat little, ask nothing. Servants avoided his eyes. Slaves crossed themselves when he entered a room. He learned to read in a garden where a previous tutor had been found face down in a fountain. He learned to pray in a home where the statues bled from their eyes after lightning struck the altar. And he learned never to trust a smile. The empire was loud, but his childhood was silence. He saw power not as glory, but as weight. Every noble he met walked like they were balancing on swords. One misstep, and the whole theater collapsed. He watched a senator die choking on figs, the empress pretending not to notice as he clawed at his throat. He heard screams in the middle of the night, then laughter from the same room moments later. Rome was a godless machine dressed in gold, and he was being fed into it. Then Caligula died. Not quietly, not nobly. He was carved open by his own guards in a hallway still echoing with applause. They found pieces of him days later, some in his shoes, some in the folds of the curtains. When the news reached Lucius, he didn't blink. He only asked if his mother would come back now, and she did, not as a mother, not as warmth. She came back as something else entirely, an architect in widow's black, a strategist in pearls. Agrippina had not spent her exile in mourning. She had studied, she had waited, she had sharpened her ambition into a needle, and now she aimed it straight at the heart of power. She returned to her son like a general inspecting a weapon. "You've grown," she said, her voice like lacquered iron. "Good. Rome only remembers what it fears." That night, she told him about his father, not as a man, but as a lesson. "He played for position," she whispered, brushing his hair. "We play for permanence." She did not sleep that night. She wrote letters, met allies, calculated every move like a surgeon with a dull blade, and within months she seduced her way back into nobility, then into the palace. She married the Emperor Claudius, limping, awkward, half mocked by the Senate but still crowned in laurel. She became empress, her son became heir, Lucius became Nero. But not yet in name. First came the masks. He was taught to smile without warmth, to speak in phrases that could be retracted, to cry when necessary and bleed only in private. Agrippina watched his lessons like a blacksmith watches the forging of a blade. The tutors were changed weekly. If they taught too little, they were dismissed. If they taught too much, they were never seen again. In private, she told him who to trust. In public, she made him untouchable. When his stepbrother Britannicus began coughing blood, no one questioned it. When senators who disapproved of Nero's rising influence were accused of treason, no one protested. Agrippina had returned not as a mother, but as an empire in disguise, and Nero, young, careful, empty-eyed, was her weapon. But something else had begun to grow inside him. Not ambition, not virtue, not even hatred. It was something colder, a kind of awareness. That love was conditional. That power made the rules. That if he listened long enough, stayed silent long enough, obeyed just enough, one day he would write the rules himself. And when that day came, even his mother would not be safe. The marriage was not for love. Nothing Agrippina did was. It was strategy, veiled in lace and ritual. Claudius was old, bent, his speech slurred from strokes and fear, but he wore the laurel, and Agrippina knew. To touch the crown, she didn't need to wear it. She only needed her son to. She entered the palace like a widow attending her own funeral, silent, immaculate, eyes lowered, but every step she took resounded like thunder. Rome had not seen a woman like her in generations. She was not seductive like Messalina, not maternal like Livia. She was sharp, surgical, a woman who had survived Caligula, seduced an emperor, and returned from exile with her son in tow. And that son was changing. Lucius no longer whispered. He observed. He did not ask what he was allowed to do. He calculated what he could get away with. He was only 15, but his voice carried differently now, laced with something ancient. When he walked through the gardens, servants bowed not from obligation, but from caution. A dog barked at him once, just once, and disappeared by morning. Claudius, the emperor, welcomed him with tired affection. He taught Nero to read laws, listen to senators, and study history. Nero listened, but what he remembered were the contradictions, that Rome praised justice, yet killed without trial, that emperors were called gods, yet died screaming, that loyalty was always temporary. Agrippina saw his eyes darkening. She smiled. Then the murders began. First, a cousin, suspected of holding a secret claim to the throne, drowned while hunting. Then a noblewoman fell ill the morning after visiting Agrippina's villa. Then came Britannicus. The boy was the true son of Claudius, legitimate by blood and birth, younger than Nero but loved by the palace. His smile reminded the court of better years. Nero watched him during meals, watched the way their father touched Britannicus' hair, called him my joy. Agrippina noticed too. One night, during a feast, Britannicus took a sip of wine. He coughed once, again, then began clawing at his throat. His skin turned gray. He collapsed, shaking. No one moved. Claudius froze, trembling in his seat. Nero looked across the table. His cup was untouched. Britannicus died in silence. Agrippina said nothing. But that night, she placed a ring on Nero's finger and said, "You are now the only son Rome remembers." Claudius did not mourn long. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps, on some level, he accepted the cost of survival. But the next cup of mushrooms he ate, his favorite, was not as forgiving. He died in his sleep. Agrippina claimed it was a stomach ailment. The physician said nothing. The cook vanished. And Lucius, no longer just a boy, was crowned emperor. At 16. The crown did not fit. It did not have to. He stood before the Senate, draped in gold, the laurel trembling on his brow. Applause rang like thunder. Trumpets wailed, but in his mind, there was only silence. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, all of them watching, whispering through the marble. And somewhere behind him, his mother's breath, cool and close. "Smile, my son. The gods are watching." He did. That night, he stood before a mirror, not a polished bronze plate, not a servant's eye, a real mirror imported from the East, framed in ivory. He stared at himself for hours. The curve of his lips, the tilt of his nose, the way his hair fell over one eye like a curtain drawn before a stage. And then he saw it. Not a boy, not a prince, not even a man. He saw something ancient, something burning quietly behind his own eyes, a god forming, not in thunder or fire, but in slow, patient decay. The kind of god Rome had always feared, unpredictable, divine, and desperately human. He whispered to the mirror, "They will remember me." Behind the door, Agrippina listened. She smiled just once, then walked away. She had built the crown, but she had no idea what she had placed it on. The city that once whispered about him now shouted his name in the streets. Nero, the boy emperor, the golden son of Rome. His first address to the Senate was short, almost shy. He spoke of justice, mercy, simplicity. He promised to end secret trials, to lower taxes, to grant the people more bread than they could eat. Senators exchanged glances, surprised. Was this another mask? Or had Agrippina created a philosopher king? The people didn't care. They roared. He abolished corrupt tributes. He freed thousands of slaves held without cause. He attended games and sat among the citizens instead of the nobles. He refused golden statues. "I want music, not marble," he said once, laughing. Rome swooned. The poets compared him to Apollo. The orators called him the dawn after a long and bloody night. And, for a while, he seemed to believe it himself. He wept at tragedies. He donated to cities struck by famine. He walked through the forum without guards. Women sent him perfume-slicked letters. Soldiers named their sons after him. Even the Senate, though wary, began to believe they had been spared another tyrant. But in the shadows, his mother watched. She saw the crowds, yes, but she also saw the hunger in his eyes. Not for governance, not for Rome, for something else, something deeper. Applause. Nero did not want to rule. He wanted to perform. His voice, once soft, now echoed in marble halls as he read lines of Euripides to slaves, to servants, to anyone who would listen. He summoned musicians from Greece, sculptors from Alexandria, dancers from the East. His bedroom filled with lyres and masks. He painted his face, rehearsed scenes, recited poems naked in the moonlight. Agrippina warned him, "You are emperor, not actor." He only smiled. What's the difference? Soon, his private recitals became public. He sang for the Senate. At first, they clapped, then they were ordered to. Attendance became mandatory. Applause became measured. Faint praise was punished. A general who yawned during a performance was later found posted to the edge of the empire, commanding goats. Nero began writing songs, odes to stars, to fire, to his own soul. He composed one about a bird trapped in a cage that could only sing when it cut its wings. The audience wept. They did not understand it, but they wept anyway. He banned criticism, executed a playwright who parodied him in a tavern, ordered a historian's tongue removed for describing him as melancholy. The boy emperor who once gave bread now gave silence. Where his love was not returned, he replaced it with fear. When applause wasn't enough, he staged it. One night, he hosted a festival in his palace courtyard. Citizens were invited to witness the divine voice of the empire. Nero descended in a robe of golden thread, a laurel of sapphires on his head. He sang for 3 hours. When a woman fainted from the heat, she was dragged away silently. When a man tried to leave for the latrine, he was beaten and returned bleeding. "No one leaves before the god is finished," the guards whispered. And Nero sang louder. He wasn't Nero now. He was Orpheus. He was Apollo. He was every star in the Roman sky burning at once. He sang until the stars above seemed to blur, until his voice cracked, until the wine turned bitter in his throat. And still they clapped, because not clapping was treason. The poets still wrote hymns to him, but now the verses were cautious. The people still loved him, but now they looked over their shoulders first. Rome still adored Nero, but like a lion adored in a cage, beautiful, unpredictable, and better not looked at for too long. The cruelty didn't come in waves. It crept. He began purging those who had mocked his performances. Senators were executed for laughing during a lyric. A painter was tortured for drawing his nose too sharp. The guards grew bold, arresting citizens for disharmonious attitudes. Nero said nothing. He only asked how large the next theater should be built. Agrippina began to fear him. She tried to remind him where the throne came from. He ignored her. She tried again, louder, public. He didn't answer. One day, she found her guards replaced. The next day, her carriage was gone. On the third, a servant she trusted was found drowned. And Nero kept singing. In the mirror, his smile grew wider. He practiced bows. He studied Greek masks. He whispered to himself, over and over, "Rome needs beauty, and I am beauty." The golden boy of Rome had become something else. Not emperor, not artist, but a god, trapped in flesh, craving worship. And the empire was learning that when gods aren't adored enough, they start to punish. He no longer asked for silence before he sang. He demanded it, not with words, but with a raised hand, a tilt of the head, a moment of breathless stillness that rippled through every corridor of power. The Senate, once filled with voices of debate and law, became a theater of trembling eyes and clutched chests. Generals who had conquered mountains now studied scripts like frightened apprentices. Ambassadors crossed seas not with treaties, but with flattery bound in leather, praising the imperial voice. Nero had become the aria. He believed, with a fevered certainty, that his voice was not merely pleasing, it was divine. A sacred channel through which the gods wept and laughed. He called it his flame, and like fire, it demanded oxygen, applause, worship, total devotion. In the marble halls of Domus Aurea, his golden house, Nero held court not with advisors but with playwrights, musicians, and sycophants. He no longer asked what Rome needed. He only asked how he sounded. At first, performances were held once a week, then 3 times, then every night. He transformed the imperial court into an amphitheater, complete with seating assignments based on loyalty, proximity to power, and previous displays of enthusiasm. He entered dressed in white silk, sandals laced with golden thread, face powdered like the statues of Apollo. The laurel no longer left his head. He wore it to breakfast, to bath, to bed, even alone. Audiences were instructed when to gasp, when to cry, when to rise to their feet in thunderous orchestrated awe. A wrong reaction was not a mistake. It was an insult to the gods. And Nero remembered every face. One night, during an ode to the divine sorrow of sunlight, a minor nobleman, drunk, tired, or perhaps merely foolish, laughed too early. A single breath, sharp and clear, before the final note. The room froze. Nero's eyes did not blink. The performance ended. The crowd applauded louder than ever before. But the nobleman was not seen again. The next morning, his estate was seized. His wife was forced into servitude. His body, disfigured, was found nailed to a fig tree along the Appian Way. A sign above him, discord. After that, Rome learned to smile wider. The odes grew stranger. One described a lover so beautiful that stars dimmed in his presence. Another spoke of a man who tore out his own eyes so he might see with the soul. But the most disturbing were those sung in the third person, hymns to the emperor himself. He walks like thunder behind a veil, one line went. He weeps, and the Tiber bows. Soon, Nero began performing them in temples, then in the Forum, then in public squares where the poor were forced to attend under penalty of grain rations being cut. He built a colossus of himself, 50 feet high, arms outstretched as if offering the city his voice. The people joked in secret that it was really to catch them if they tried to run. He believed their love was real, and that made him dangerous. Senators who spoke against him were accused of auditory treason. One who suggested lowering the imperial budget was ordered to sing his explanation before the court, naked, bound, and surrounded by musicians instructed to drown out any sense he might make. When his voice cracked, he was stabbed mid-note. Even the generals fell in line. Men who had fought barbarians in the snows of Germania now clapped with bleeding palms after each performance. They wrote letters home praising his sacred cadence and comparing his breath to the west wind. One veteran, who had lost 3 sons in battle, once asked aloud if the emperor might consider visiting the front. That night, he vanished. His wife received a poem the next morning, signed by Nero. Even stones must break to let the river sing. Rome listened, because it had no choice. Behind the grandeur, fear bloomed like rot. Men hired actors to coach them in theatrical weeping. Women fainted on cue. Entire families rehearsed applause patterns by candlelight. Children were taught not to cry too loud during performances, lest they be silenced forever. In private, Nero whispered to his own reflection. They never understood Augustus. They feared Caligula. They tolerated Claudius. But I will be loved, even if I must burn the world to make them listen. And the mirror nodded. She had raised him to rule, not to sing. Agrippina had carved a path through blood and ash to place the laurel on her son's brow. But now he was no longer her son. He was something else, painted, adored, unpredictable. And worst of all, he no longer listened. She watched from the shadows as Nero's gaze drifted farther from Rome and deeper into his own reflection. She heard the applause that followed him like a fever, saw the gold stitched into his robes, the young boys who ran behind his chariot with incense. She remembered when he had trembled under her hand, and she began to whisper, at first only to her allies in the Senate. A raised eyebrow, a careful comment. The boy is distracted. Rome needs a man, not a muse. Perhaps the gods are waiting for his voice to rest. But whispers echo in marble halls. Nero heard. Not the words exactly, but the weight of them. He saw the subtle shifts in the Senate chamber, the way some senators stood straighter when Agrippina entered, how a few dared to speak after her gaze lingered. He saw how she still visited the temples, how her name was still invoked in certain prayers. He felt the shadow she cast over his throne, and it terrified him. She had shaped him, yes, but what she created, she still believed she could unmake. He remembered the way she looked at him now, not as a mother, but as a sculptor displeased with the statue. He knew that look. It meant the chisel was coming, so he struck first. One evening, he sent her a gift, her favorite wine, rare and perfumed from the East. She drank it gladly, smiling behind the cup. But before dawn, her body seized, her hands clawed at her throat. Servants were sent running. She survived. Nero cursed the slow poisoner, ordered a new plan. He invited her to Baiae, a coastal retreat, promised reconciliation, promised music and calm waters. He built a special boat for her arrival. A marvel of engineering, he said, spacious, grand, fit for a mother of Rome. She boarded it smiling. In the early hours, beneath the moonlight, the bolts were loosened. The hull collapsed inward like a mouth swallowing itself. Screams rang over the water. Pieces of marble and silk floated like bones. But Agrippina did not drown. She swam. With water in her lungs and salt in her eyes, she clawed through the dark sea like something born again. When she reached shore, wounded and shaking, she did not run. She returned to her villa, silent, soaked, and furious. And Nero began to panic. A son could attempt to poison his mother. A son could sink her ship. But a son who failed to kill his mother twice was not a god. He paced the halls of his palace like a boy haunted. He dreamed of her standing over him, her face bloated with seawater, whispering prayers in a language no one spoke anymore. He ordered her watched, her letters seized, her visitors interrogated. But Agrippina stayed still. She made no move, sent no message, gave no warning. That silence was worse than a dagger. So he sent soldiers. No more games, no more poisons, no more clever shipwrecks, just steel. They arrived at her villa at night, a pounding on the door, the torches flaring, the servants screaming. She stood in her chambers, calm. Her hair was unbound, her hands were open. When they broke through, she did not run. She looked at the captain of the guard, the blade in his hand, and smiled. "So," she said, "my son sends murderers. Does he not have the courage to do it himself?" She pulled back her robe, revealed her stomach. "Strike here first," she said. "Strike the womb that bore him." They did. The blood ran hot and quick. And in the palace, Nero waited for news, pacing, biting his nails until they bled. When the message came, one word, "done," he exhaled for the first time in weeks. But that night, when he looked into the mirror, he saw her eyes, and they did not blink. Poppaea entered his life like a perfume. Subtle at first, then impossible to forget. She was everything Agrippina had ceased to be. Soft where the empress had been iron, yielding where his mother had been sharp. But beneath the alabaster skin and gentle voice was a mind as calculating as any in Rome. She didn't challenge him, she praised him, worshipped him, called him divine even before the crown could. Nero fell like a boy starved for affection. He was still young, but now drunk with power, high on applause, and terrified of silence. Poppaea filled the spaces between his fears. She whispered lullabies and ambition into his ears. She told him the gods had placed him here for more than law or war, for beauty, for immortality, for legacy. And he believed her. She was married when they met. So was he. Neither of those things lasted long. He divorced his wife, Octavia, on false charges of infertility. When the people rioted, demanding justice for the beloved daughter of Claudius, Nero had her exiled, then strangled. Then her head was delivered to Poppaea on a silver plate. The riots stopped. Poppaea smiled. They married beneath a sky black with incense smoke, and Nero wept at the altar. He called her his Venus, said her womb would bear gods. Her beauty, he claimed, calmed the winds and stirred the stars. He commissioned statues, hundreds, carved in her likeness, placed in temples beside those of real goddesses. But gods bore tempers, and Nero's love was never gentle for long. One evening, in the heat of a summer storm, Poppaea questioned him. Something small, a detail, a missed engagement, a performance rescheduled without his consent. Her voice was soft, but her timing was wrong. He had been drinking, mourning another failed verse, and the rage that lived behind his eyes, always waiting, surged forward. They say he kicked her, that it was sudden, one blow, that she fell backward onto the marble, that her hands went first to her belly, then her mouth, as blood began to spread across her robe like spilled wine. She was pregnant. Neither of them survived the night. The palace fell into a strange hush. Nero did not weep in front of the court. He locked himself away, then emerged days later with eyes wild and voice hoarse, demanding the construction of a golden tomb, a new temple, and a choir to sing her name every morning at sunrise. He wrote an ode to her breath, had it etched in gold, declared a new festival, the Poppaea Games, where no one was allowed to frown. Rome obeyed, but Rome watched. The emperor began speaking of dreams, that she wasn't truly gone, that death could not silence what the gods had touched. He paced the halls whispering to shadows. Then, one day he found a boy. The child was delicate, pale, with wide, frightened eyes and hair the color of ash. His name was Sporus. He was perhaps 12. Nero renamed him. He had him bathed in rosewater, perfumed, dressed in silk. Then he had him taken, surgically, castrated, to preserve the divine form. The court physicians obeyed in silence. When Sporus recovered, he was presented to the court in a bridal veil. Nero married him in a public ceremony, calling him Poppaea. He took him in the imperial litter, showed him off like a jewel, kissed him in the forum, sang to him before senators, held him during state addresses. At night, he whispered to the boy's bruised face, called him my star, and claimed the gods had returned her soul to him in a purer vessel. The boy did not speak. Rome was silent too, not because it understood, but because it feared what it did not. The poets stopped writing. The senators stopped speaking. Only the statues remained, cold, golden, and smiling. Hundreds of them lining the palace halls, the city roads, the temples, all bearing her face, her frozen perfection, her absence. But the gods, it seemed, did not stay silent. Lightning struck the Capitoline Hill. A statue of Apollo cracked down the middle. A fire consumed part of the Temple of Vesta. A river turned red with silt and dead fish. The priests called for cleansing. Nero declared it coincidence, then wrote a new hymn. He sang it to Sporus that night. And somewhere outside the palace walls, the people of Rome began to wonder what sin could possibly be left for the emperor to commit. The summer heat had thickened the air like oil. Rome was restless, parched, and filled with rumors, whispers of revolt, of famine, of gods offended. But when the first flames erupted in the Circus Maximus, sudden, devouring, and alive, the city screamed with one voice, fire. It leapt like a curse, wind-fueled, insatiable. It spread from stall to stall, alley to alley, faster than horses could flee. Wooden rooftops ignited like kindling, oil stores exploded, temples crumbled, statues wept molten bronze. Children vanished in smoke. Mothers clawed the ground, searching for bones. Priests dropped their icons and ran. For 6 days, Rome burned. Of the city's 14 districts, 10 turned to ash. Sacred ground was blackened. Generations buried in marble now cracked and open. The sky bled red for nights on end, and as the people cried out, begging for water, for order, for mercy, their emperor sang. Nero stood atop the palace roof, draped in robes of silver and saffron, a lyre in his hand, his voice rising above the smoke. He sang of Troy, of ancient flames, of gods watching cities fall. He swayed with the firelight, eyes glistening, mouth open not in horror, but in rapture. They say his guards formed a circle to protect the performance, that musicians accompanied him as families screamed below, that he smiled when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning flesh. And when the city fell quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion, Nero descended, refreshed. He blamed the Christians. He had to. Rome was angry, hungry, lost, and they needed a villain, not a god. The Christians had always been strange, refusing to worship the emperor, refusing to bow to the old gods, whispering of resurrection and martyrdom, meeting in tombs, preaching love to slaves and apocalypse to kings. Now they were fire-bringers. Nero declared it. His scribes spread the word. The Christians had started the fire to cleanse Rome of sin, that they were agents of death, enemies of beauty, blasphemers of everything sacred. The city turned, roundups began. At first quiet, surgical, then open, brutal. Entire families were dragged into the streets, bound and weeping. Names were extracted under torture. Faith became a death sentence, but Nero did not hide their fate. He made it theater. At the foot of the Palatine Hill, crosses were raised by the dozens. Christians were nailed in silence. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were coated in pitch and set aflame at night to light Nero's garden paths. He called them human torches. He walked among them in white. He invited the court to watch. Senators sipped wine as the condemned burned. Nobles placed bets on who would scream first. Musicians played. Dancers twirled. Saurus, dressed as Poppaea, wept behind a veil. And Rome watched. Some cried, some cheered. Most simply survived. But beneath the ash and terror, something shifted. The Christians did not break as expected. They sang as they died. Their eyes lifted skyward, their lips moved in prayer. The more Nero tortured them, the more they believed. The more they burned, the more their stories spread. A soldier who lit the pyres began wearing a hidden cross. A noblewoman fed a Christian child in secret. And in the charred ruins of a temple, someone etched a single phrase in Greek. "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Nero read it and laughed, then ordered it burned. But fire, once loosed, does not always obey its master. Rome was rebuilding, yes, but in the shadows of monuments now blackened. Nero's golden house, his palace reborn from the ashes, stretched across the city like a wound. Colonnades of ivory, domes painted with stars, pools of mercury, a rotating dining room so the heavens could dine with him. He called it the center of the world. The people called it something else, though not aloud. They whispered in the streets, behind tapestries, inside bathhouses. Some said Nero had started the fire himself, desperate to erase the old Rome and raise a new one, his Rome. Others said he'd gone mad, that he slept beside his lyre and sang in his dreams, that he still heard the screams, and beneath the gold, the city waited. Because every note must end, and even gods must breathe. The Domus Aurea was not built with mortar and marble. It was built with silence, the kind that follows screams too long ignored. Nero's golden house rose like a dream through the ashes of the old city, a wound stitched in gold and mother of pearl. Its construction swallowed entire districts. Homes were flattened, markets erased, temples relocated or destroyed entirely. Where families once bartered for bread, now stood gates taller than towers, carved with images of the emperor embracing Jupiter, Apollo, and the sun. The entrance alone stretched the length of a village. Inside, corridors spiraled like intestines, each chamber more decadent than the last. Walls shimmered with crushed lapis and ivory inlays. Pools reflected ceilings painted with shifting skies, not painted with brush, but with mechanism. Nero's engineers devised a dome that turned with the wind, rotating above the central dining hall as guests dined beneath stars that moved like gods watching from above. The floor sang when stepped on. The walls whispered his name. Perfume misted from golden pipes in rhythms that matched his heartbeat. He walked barefoot, always, so that the marble could recognize him. To the public, he spoke of rebirth, of divine alignment, that Rome, like the phoenix, had needed fire to ascend. He promised new gardens, new roads, but while his vision stretched to the heavens, his people starved in alleys beneath the scaffolding of his dream. Grain shipments were delayed. Bread was taxed. The public fountains dried. When complaints reached him, he blinked, confused. How could they not see the beauty? To Nero, the Domus Aurea was not luxury. It was revelation. He believed the gods lived in its walls, spoke through the frescoes, sang to him in the resonance of the stone. At night, he walked alone through its halls, robes trailing like mist, whispering hymns to no one. He claimed to hear voices in the mineral veins. Apollo had told him Rome was now divine. Jupiter had said his blood was no longer mortal. The Senate sent word of unrest, of famine, of theft. He replied with a marble bust of himself, smiling. When senators dared speak in private of removing him, they found themselves named in anonymous letters, accused of treason, heresy, perversion. Trials were held at dusk, executions by dawn. One senator slit his own wrists in a bath, then used the blood to write, "I die, but Rome bleeds deeper." Nero read it, laughed, ordered the message engraved outside his bedroom. He began performing inside the palace. Small audiences, select friends, none allowed to leave until they'd wept. He called these divine communions. He wore robes threaded with firefly wings, sang in languages he invented. Once, he entered the hall naked, but for a crown of thorns made of gold. He told his guests he had just spoken with Apollo, and the god had asked for a monument of flesh. No one asked what that meant. Outside, Rome twisted in hunger and smoke. Children vanished into construction sites. Whole neighborhoods now bore the name Neropolis. And still, the emperor expanded his house. There was a room for listening to rain, another that mimicked the sea, a chamber filled with mirrors that reflected nothing but his face. The boy Sporus, now grown but still silent, wandered its halls like a ghost. He was dressed as Poppaea, always. Nero called him my echo. Sometimes, guests would enter a chamber and find the emperor alone, weeping before a statue of his mother. Other times, he would order a play to be performed where all the characters were versions of himself. He laughed, cried, clapped for himself. The Domus Aurea had no windows. The outside world was not welcome. Even the Senate, when summoned, was made to enter barefoot, robes soaked in incense, their eyes lowered. Nero addressed them not as emperor, but as chosen voice. When one senator questioned the latest tax to fund more pearls for the dining room floor, Nero stared for a moment, then asked, "Do birds question the sky?" That senator's tongue was later found nailed to the doors of a temple. Rome began to whisper again, but the whispers were thin now. Starved, tired, those who had once shouted his name in the streets now spoke it only in prayer, not for glory, but for protection. Still, Nero expanded. The palace was never finished, because it was not meant to be. It grew like a parasite, feeding off the corpse of the empire. Every month, a new wing, a new hall, a new god etched into its frame. He began drawing his own mythologies, carving scenes of his life as if they were ancient. He depicted himself healing lepers, defeating titans, raising the sun with a lyre. And deep beneath the palace, in a vault lined with obsidian, he had a single chair carved from bone. He sat there sometimes in silence, listening, waiting for the gods to speak again. But even they had grown quiet. The walls that once sang now echoed hollow. The domus aurea stood vast and gleaming, but empty, like a corpse painted in gold. The voices Nero once claimed to hear had gone mute. No whispers from Apollo, no warmth from Jupiter, only the crackling of wax seals breaking, the thud of sandals fleeing down mosaic corridors, and the thunder of distant hooves. It began in Gaul, then Spain. Provinces that once celebrated him now spit his name. Armies rose not in defense but in defiance. Roman governors declared allegiance to new claimants, not kings, but restorers. Men with blades and tired eyes, they no longer feared his gaze, his voice, his plays. They feared something worse, collapse. Even the Praetorian Guard, long paid in gold and favor, began to falter. Rumors spread that Galba marched toward Rome with legions at his back, that Egypt no longer sent grain, that the Senate was whispering of succession, a word that stank of blood. In the Senate chambers, there were no more veiled praises, no more fear of being seen without tears during one of Nero's performances. Instead, there were oaths, signed, delivered, names spoken plainly, his included, enemy of the state. When the news reached him, Nero did not scream. He did not rage. He simply stopped speaking. For hours. Then rose, alone, walked into the statue room of his palace, and stood among his likenesses, 100 Neros carved from stone and bronze and ivory. He touched one on the cheek and whispered, "They've turned away. Even you." He tried to gather support. No one came. The halls that once echoed with feasts and music were now corridors of echoing footsteps and unanswered calls. He summoned Sporus. Gone. Called for Tigellinus. Fled. Even the slaves had vanished, taking only what they could carry, leaving silks torn and food rotting. So Nero disguised himself. He wrapped his face in cloth, stole a servant's cloak, and fled the palace on foot, barefoot, beneath a sky that once bowed to him. He wandered the city he had rebuilt from fire, now unrecognizable. Ash and gold, anger and famine. Every face was a stranger, every street a betrayal. He whispered prayers to gods he once claimed spoke through his mouth. No one answered. He found shelter at last in the home of a freedman, once a loyal secretary, now a terrified host. They hid him in a cellar, straw, dust, a jug of stale water, a single oil lamp. There, for the first time in his life, Nero heard silence. Not the silence of awe, not the silence before applause, but a silence that suffocated. That swallowed the edges of his thoughts and left behind nothing but memory. He asked for a mirror. No one brought one. He begged to hear music. No one sang. When word arrived that the Senate had officially condemned him to death and that soldiers were en route not to arrest but to retrieve, Nero pressed his hands to the dirt floor and whispered, "Is this what it means to be forgotten?" The freedman wept and offered him a blade. Nero stared at it, but he could not lift it. He begged his host, "Strike me. Show Rome it was my will." The man hesitated. Nero screamed, "Have I neither friend nor enemy left?" Then, trembling, he took the blade in both hands and pressed it against his throat. The freedman helped him finish. As the soldiers approached, they found the emperor gurgling on blood, not dead yet, and muttering the last thing he would ever say, "What an artist dies in me." He died with no crown, no robe, no song, and for the first time in all of Rome, no one applauded. They found him in a cellar that stank of mildew and old sweat, curled like a child beneath a threadbare cloak. No sandals, no crown. A crust of wine dried on his lips. When the soldiers knocked, he flinched as if struck, eyes wide and shining in the oil lamp's flicker. For a moment, the Emperor of Rome looked no more imperial than a rat caught in a drain. The sound of boots drew closer. Metal on stone. The smell of iron. Nero rose slowly, not like a man preparing to fight, but like a man rehearsing a scene for the 100th time. He touched his chest, then his throat. There was no lyre, no costume, no applause. He turned to the freedman at his side, voice trembling yet theatrical. "They come," he said, "to witness my final performance." Outside, the guards waited, not speaking. The execution order lay folded in a satchel. It was not to be read aloud. It was to be shown. It bore a seal, not of Nero's eagle, but of the Senate's blackened fist. Inside, the lamp flickered. Nero lifted a dagger, a small thing, thin. His hands shook. He stared at it like a prophecy. He tried to speak again, tried to conjure a farewell worthy of history. A monologue, a lament, a final cry to the gods that once clung to his shoulders. But no words came. His lips parted, then closed. His mouth tasted only dust. He pressed the dagger against his throat. The flesh did not part, not yet. He looked at the freedman, tears forming. "Will no one help me?" he whispered. "Not even now?" Silence. And then softly, he mouthed the line, his line. Not for the Senate, not for the guards, not for Rome, but for himself. A whisper, a prayer, a curse. "What an artist dies in me." Then he drove the blade inward. Not deep, not sure, but enough. The freedman, choking on fear, helped push. Blood welled. Nero gasped, not a scream, not a cry, but the sound of realization, of finality. The actor was not acting. When the soldiers entered moments later, they found him collapsed, gurgling, twitching in a widening pool of red. No longer emperor, no longer feared, no longer anything but flesh returning to dirt. He died on the floor of a servant's home, a man who once ruled an empire that spanned from the deserts of Africa to the hills of Britannia, a man who believed himself a god. The Senate did not declare a day of mourning. No temple was erected in his name. No song was sung. The body was burned in secret, ashes scattered beneath night. But Rome remembered, not with honor, not with grief, but with stories. They said he would return, that he had escaped, disguised and gone east, to Parthia, or Egypt, or some island hidden beyond the reach of time. That one day he would come back with an army of fire and sound and finish what he started. His name became a warning, a ghost. Children were taught to fear him. Artists invoked him. Emperors cursed his memory while stealing his style. And every so often a whisper would rise in the streets. He's not dead, because tyrants die, but myths don't.